Good morning. Let me sound platitudinous by saying what a privilege it is for me to be here. I know that people often say that, but I really mean it. I've been treated as if the pleasure of me being here is all yours, but I tell you that the pleasure is mine. There's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place, and I've had the pleasure of experiencing it the whole weekend. Growing up in the South, in my earliest days, I had a fondness for the book of Proverbs, and there was a particular verse there that says, a person's gifts makes room for them and brings them before great people. I think I'm experiencing the fulfillment of that verse in one way this morning because I was told that Miss Nancy McDonald is in the audience, a giant of human rights and social justice. So it is my pleasure to be in your presence today. I'm happy to have the privilege of speaking with you this morning. Last night we had a glorious evening in this sanctuary. And because I consider it a privilege to be here, I also know that with privilege comes responsibility. And for me, I've taken the responsibility this morning humbly to be the messenger as we reach for truth and build community. And I seek to do that this morning by inviting you along with me on a meditation that I have entitled Jesus and the A Word, which I also offer to you as the title for my remarks. When I refer to the religious significance that choosing to provide abortion means for me personally, both religious and non-religious people alike are perplexed. They can't understand where the consistency would be in self-describing as a Christian and performing the highly controversial medical service called abortion. In a religious sense, I consider myself a follower of Christ, which doesn't necessarily require you to be a Christian in the conventional sense of the term, just as the Mahatma Gandhi was a follower of Jesus in terms of the tremendous love ethic, while religiously a Hindu, and the prominent Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a close confidant and mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King, who recognized the religious universality and the importance of Christian love ethic. My embrace of love as a transcendent power that results in compassion has, above all, been my guiding principle in my life. It's allowed me to be more present and to be more fully human as I consider current affairs and decide what my role is in reacting to those, particularly on issues of social and reproductive justice. It was also, by self-describing as a follower of Christ versus a Christian, it was also a hedge, because I did not want to be identified with those people who very forcefully called themselves Christian, but who practiced a style of Christianity that was not loving, that was not compassionate, and that was very exclusionary. So now I've decided to no longer hedge. I am a Christian. I am a follower of Christ. I refuse to abdicate the responsibility of figuring out what that means and to carry that title and to demonstrate the compassion that people should recognize to be more consistent with the notion of Christianity than the use of Christianity as a shield for bigotry. Because I'm a Christian, one of the most riveting expressions of Christian compassion that's motivated by love action is to be found in the story of Jesus and his response to a woman in the process of being stoned for the allegation of adultery. Not everyone's familiar with that story, so I'll quickly read the scriptural passage where it's found in the book, in the Gospel according to John, the 8th chapter. I'm going to share from the New Living Translation. And it reads this following: Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he went back again to the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd, and they said, "Teacher." They said, "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until Jesus only was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Then neither do I. Go and sin no more." Now, in my office, I have a painting depicting this scene, the actions, and it depicts the scenes where Jesus comes upon this woman who was accused of adultery and condemned to the penalty of being stoned to death. And as I meditated on this picture, it prompted several epiphanies. I was initially intrigued by the fact that in this picture, Jesus was portrayed as a person of color. He had an afro and a beard. I used to have an afro. I still have a beard. But as I took the piece in and began thinking about my choices as an abortion provider, as a person moved by compassion to act on behalf of my patients because of my spiritual understanding, I then developed other thoughts. One of the first one was that the woman depicted in the painting had been accused of adultery and was being judged for her sexual behavior. It had been criminalized, and in this case it was punishable by death, but it was being done by the religious establishment. My first thought was, where's her male consort? She was accused of adultery, so there had to be somebody else involved. So where was her male consort, and what penalty or judgment was he face? To contemporize this story, one needs to only change the letter A from adultery to abortion. And it doesn't take much to see the striking parallels that I found as I looked at this story of what happened to this woman. In this picture, there's a whole crowd of folk. And while I panned that crowd in the painting, it showed the woman to be in the center, surrounded by her accusers, cowering with stones all around her. And when I noticed the people in the crowd, and they represented the religious establishment, everyone in the process of executing this woman had beards, impressing upon me that both culturally, well, first of all, they either were men or they were women with hormone problems. That's a little gynecologist joke. But what those beards represented to me, then as now, that both culturally and religiously, that the people accusing that woman and opposing her human rights were primarily patriarchal men with a few misguided women thrown in for good measure. All right. All right. Now, in this depiction, Jesus, nonconformist with the religious practice of Judaism of his day that excluded women, Jesus always had women in his inner circle. Jesus intervenes in this public humiliation of this woman accused of a socially unacceptable behavior. Then it was adultery, today it's abortion. And his actions when he intervened were unorthodox, but they were within his religious tradition, not outside of it. In the depiction, I noticed that Jesus, when he responded to this woman, he didn't take her by the hand and run. He didn't launch into a rebuttal based on systematic theology, nor did he verbally challenge the apparent callousness of the religious order of his day. He simply sought to provoke a deeper understanding of that faith tradition with a statement and compassionate action, forcing everyone in attendance to self-examine And that examination will either lead them to conviction that would change their behavior or to the declaration of a blatant hypocrisy. He said, he that is among you that is without fault should cast the first stone. Now, that statement, in my estimate, was a simple but profound reminder of either the equalizing aspect of humanity or the humanizing aspect of equality. But either way, if that question is entertained honestly, it makes it impossible for any of us to judge another person for the situation that they're in. So Jesus kneels next to the woman in the painting, and he writes on the ground. In this painting, he writes G-R-A-C-E, grace. Now, in this painting, as I said, I'm trying to help you see what I saw and hopefully provoke some of the epiphanies that I had. As I said, they were standing in the center. There are boulders and rocks all around. The woman's like this. Jesus is kneeling next to her, writing G-R-A-C-E on the ground. And all the men are standing there with beards. Now, my traditional thinking about this action initially led me to think that he was calling for grace, unmerited favor by God for this woman in distress, which is what I was taught grace is. However, as I looked at this picture longer and thought a little deeper, a whole nother significance came to me about Jesus' action. Was grace actually that woman's name? If grace was this woman's name, if so, how did he discern it right there in the midst of her crisis? In order to determine her name, if he had never met her before, he would have had to wade through the throngs of religious folk and out of the crowd into someone being actively stoned to support a woman who's being shamed and attacked. In the midst of a stoning, Jesus, in order to help this woman, had to place himself in harm's way. To go to her in the midst of the stoning meant that he too could have been stoned. To oppose the religious order sometimes by choosing at that moment to be more identified with his humanity than his religious identity was to buck the establishment, and as we know, ultimately that was what got Jesus killed. But on this day, and in this situation, that was the action that was needed. And at that moment, he became an example of all that religion should be. It should lead in our development to compassion, in our ability to respond to our neighbor, or it becomes the most serious indictment against religion of any type when it fails to rise to that standard, whatever the tradition. So my experience with abortion, both as I perceive it for the women who come to me and for myself as a provider and those who, like me, provide this care, bear striking parallels with the scenario that I just described to you. Women are often judged and shamed for their God-given reality of human sexuality in ways that men never are, whether it be for adultery, abortion, or giving birth out of wedlock. Holding the radical notion that women and men are equal in their humanity like the Jesus in this painting, I have not been able to stand by idly and watch women denied their human or reproductive rights. Compassion that rises up in me because I am a Christian propels me into action, with me being more attentive to the need of the women than to the consequences that might accrue to me for defying the social order. My contact with patients seeking my care allows me to, like Jesus in this scenario knew that woman's name, I know their names. I know their stories. I know their circumstances. And like Jesus' ability to write what I choose to interpret that woman's name as Grace on the ground, in addition to knowing her name was Grace, he administered grace to her, and therefore he was moved to provide what she needed at that moment, which was literally physical protection. As one of many providers who is harassed for providing women with health care called abortion, the effort to provide this care sometimes places me in harm's way. Oftentimes that harm is imperceptible to me. I'm not in denial about that, but rather the narrowed focus that I hold of trusting the rightness and the appropriateness of responding to human need has made me oblivious to any anxiety that could be provoked by worrying about what might happen to me because of what I'm doing. And because of that, I've chosen to only interact with real threats and not hypothetical ones. And for me, there have been no real threats. There have been people like the folk outside standing, but there have been no real threats for me. In my meditation on this painting, I could not help but think that the only thing that would have allowed Jesus to walk into the midst of a stoning to rescue that woman was that at that moment, her safety was what had his attention, and not the angry crowd of the folk around them. A contemporary analogy of this would be the high likelihood that I would bet a nickel that anyone sitting in this audience this morning would, without hesitating, dart into the street to grab a child from the path of an oncoming car by thinking more about the safety of that child than the likelihood of being struck by that car. This action would not be, this would be an action of soul and of spirit. It wouldn't be the fruit of conscious, deliberate risk-taking. I imagine that at some level, every one of my colleagues who provides abortions operates in this way. So this meditation has nurtured me multiple times in what I consider my very mindful approach to my work. My return to this compassionate motivation understanding of why I do what I do has been far more sustaining for me than the insistence on providing abortions because they're legal. The moral authority that I arrive at by reaching a spiritual understanding that has demanded that I be more of a human being than I am a man, an African American, a Christian, or a heterosexual has given me the serenity to do this work. And so even though for some of my misguided brothers and sisters who sometimes choose to stand out in front of a sacred worship space like this on a beautiful Sunday morning to call me a murderer or to tell me that I'm not legitimately a Christian, I can reside in the serenity of knowing that it is always right to help someone else. So as I close, I'll tell you that that understanding allows me to fully identify with the words of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, and I leave it with you as a closing thought. Our lives no longer belong to us alone. They belong to all of those who need us desperately. God bless you.
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.